Today I'm going to be showing you how to build pathways in Minecraft. Now, as you probably already know, pathways are one of the most important part of any town, village or city because they're going to be the foundation of everything else that you build. So today we're going to go over a bunch of tips that will make your pathways feel more organic, and I'm going to show you my full build process of what I do when I'm planning my roadways in Minecraft. So before you start building your pathways, the first thing you want to do is think about what you're actually going to be building. Depending on what your goals are for your town, village or city will really be dependent on the style of pathway you want to go with. Now, I will say that any pathway that you create in-game is best to use more than just a single texture. A single texture for a pathway is going to feel very flat and very boring. So we want to create something that feels a little bit more rustic and a bit more worn down. And to do this, you want to just mix in some different textures. Now, there are many different textures you can use depending on what your kind of goals are, but generally I tend to make my paths sort of match in color. So look for color tones that work well together for your pathways. And sometimes it works really nice to kind of break your pathways up from everything else that you're building. For example, if you're building a large city that has got a lot of kind of stone textures, then think about what you can use for your pathways to break it up so that you don't have so much grey. You could go with some brick paths, maybe some dirt paths. Maybe if you're using a lot of stone, you could go to cobblestone or tuff, maybe even something like the new deep slate blocks, because these are going to add a different tone, a different variation in color, and just create a little bit more sort of life to the area rather than everything feeling like it blends in together, because too much blending of the same color is going to feel very boring. Another thing you might want to consider is the area of your town or city that you're in. And you might want to break down your pathways into different colors or different tones for different areas of the city. For example, if you was in a high class rich area, somewhere there's a castle or something like that, you might want to use a brick walkway. If you're in the general area of the town or city center, you might want to use some stone pathways. But if you're heading out of town, a stone pathway is not going to really work well if you're in kind of like a farming area or a small sort of lower class area. So maybe you might want to use some coarse dirt and dirt path. So just think about the area of the town you're in and don't be afraid to mix up a few different paths into the town to make it feel a little bit different depending on the area that you're in. Okay, now that we've gone over the textures, we will be doing a little bit of a sort of showcase of how I actually put my pathways together in a bit. But first of all, let's take a look at some basic examples of some pathways. These are a little bit more simplified, but they still give you a general idea of how you can put paths together. We're going to start with a basic pathway. So this is something that can be done early game. It simply uses a dirt path and coarse dirt for the main materials of the pathway, most of which is made up of dirt path and then just a few coarse dirt sort of scattered to the sides of the pathway. This just makes it feel a little bit more rough. Adding in a few bits of grass makes it feel a little bit overgrown, and then added in some stone buttons for a few little rocks on the sides of the path, and that's pretty much it for the main pathway itself. Now I have gone ahead and decorated it. As you can see, we've added some leaves and flowers to make some nice little bushes. We've got a cart on one side, adding in little areas of walls, so like a roughed up wall with a mix of textures, and then just like a small section. Don't add a really long bit of it, just a small section so it kind of feels like an old worn away wall. I think it works really great in farming areas. And then of course we've just got a couple of trees here, just some custom trees, just to really add a little bit of detail to the path and just make it not feel so flat. You know, the trees just had that extra height and kind of close everything in a little bit, making it feel a little bit more sort of decorative. This next pathway is great for a lead up to something that's pretty grand. So something like a castle or a church or a town hall, something pretty big. And it's a very simple path. I'm simply using bricks with granite and polished granite. That adds a really nice texture. And then just bouldering it off with some of the polished andesite. Now, as you can see, we have made a little bridge here to just make a little walkover. I think little things like bridges are great to add a form of interest, even to the pathway. You know, it's not only to your town or village, it also adds to the pathway itself because you're creating that archway on the actual path. And yeah, it just adds a really nice sort of piece of interest. Now, other than that, we have kept it pretty simple. I've added in a few little lampposts and a couple of bushes and stuff to make it look nice. But other than that, it's pretty simple. But it really depends on what you want to be building here. You could be placing sort of houses at each side of the pathway here if you wanted, or you could be keeping it open like I am, depending on where you're using it inside your city, village, or town. Next up, we have a pathway that I tend to use quite a lot in my main towns and cities, but it also works great for little pathways that lead through maybe a little wooded area and stuff like that. And that is simply using stone, andesite, stone bricks, and then a little bit of mossy cobblestone. I think these work really well together, and using the mossy cobblestone just towards the side of the path blends a little bit in with the grass, so it makes it feel a little bit overgrown from the sides, and I think it just works really well. Now, other than that, for this pathway, I have gone ahead again and made a little wall you can see there, just with some mix of textures to make it feel a little bit roughed up. But again, keeping it to just a little small piece of wall, you know, just more of a detail area rather than opposed to an actual sectioning off of a farm or a field or something like that. It's just more for detail than anything else. We've got some bushes, some custom trees, and I've mixed up some of the area on the outside of the path. You can see near the trees we've got some coarse dirt and some dirt path, just to give a little bit of a sort of different color tone in there to break things up and just make it feel a little bit more sort of worn down, as you would find if you was walking through some kind of wooded area. Next up, we have another pathway that works really well again when dividing up kind of farmland areas. If you want to use something different rather than sort of the dirt and sort of brown tones, then you could go ahead and make it a bit more roughed up like this. This is using a combination of cobblestone, mossy cobblestone, and tuff, and I think all three of these work really well to create this kind of rustic looking pathway. It works great for dividing sort of some of the sort of lower classed areas or rough where you want to see a little bit more of a rougher ground. But it's still light enough so that it blends in with everything else around it. As you can see for this path here, we've just done some simple detailing. So we've got some bushes and fences mixed in. We've made a couple of little sort of lampposts to keep a little bit of light on the path, because this pathway here would get very dark otherwise and would spawn lots of mobs. So you want to kind of think about your lighting in the process as well to make sure that you can keep areas lit up and keep those mobs away. Other than that, we just got a couple of farms on the side. I've gone ahead and added in a couple of barrels and bits like that to make it feel like it's sort of used. You know, it's just about creating little small details that make things seem like they're feeling used. So if we had just the farms there but without the workstations, it would look nice, but it wouldn't feel like it's being used. Adding in those few barrels and composters makes it feel like somebody has been here and has been harvesting, and just creates that little bit more atmosphere to the area. So try and think about those little details while you're building. Next up, we got something a little bit more fantasy-like, and this is a very simple pathway simply made up of deep slate and cobbled deep slate. We're also using a little bit of the dirt path to make it look a little bit more sort of worn down, but this creates a really nice little pathway and works really nicely going in between these mushrooms here. That dark grey really blends really well with the bright red. I don't know, it just makes it really stand out, and they really sort of complement each other. That is pretty much it for this pathway. It's very simple, there's not too much. The main bulk of the pathway is made up of deep slate with a few sort of cobbled deep slate blended in between, and then we've got the dirt path which is just scattered more towards the sides than anything else, but it works really well. Now I have gone ahead and used a load of bone meal at the sides to make it look really overgrown on each side of the path. We've added in a few trees and some of those mushrooms there to give it a little bit of an enchanted feel. And I gotta say, this is actually one of my favorite designs. I really love this pathway, and I think it could work well in so many different places. Next up, we have a really simple pathway again. This one is made up of coarse dirt, rooted dirt, brown concrete powder, and then just a few speckles of our dirt path. And as you can see, it creates a really nice looking pathway. This is great for dividing up fields and farms and stuff like that, but as you can see here, we've also got it on this little pathway that we've sort of laid out. And what I've done is I've used the oak logs and some spruce slabs to create a bit of a wall. And what I've done is I've created some little coves on each side of the pathway. And inside those coves is something different. On the two back ones, we have our farms. And on the front one, we have a little working area. So this looks really good as a little farming area. It saves having to make a really large farming area and just creates these little sections along the pathway that have a small farmed area for different things that you might need. And I think this works really nicely and would blend perfectly into a little starting village. Other than that, we've added some details with our leaves, we've added a couple of custom trees and just used a bit of bone meal around the outskirts just to create a little bit of an overgrown look here. And I think overall, this design looks really nice. For the last path design, I wanted to go ahead and just see what we could do with a desert, because I know a lot of people have been asking me recently about building in a desert, so I thought I would see what sort of pathway we could create. Now, I've got to say that the stripped birch and the birch planks work great here. And usually what I would use for pathways in a desert would be coarse dirt, but I decided to try it a little bit different with the rooted dirt. And I think the rooted dirt works so much better because it's a bit of a lighter tone and almost has a bit of a sand tone in those grooves. So it kind of really blends nicely on the area here. So I think this works perfect for a little area in a desert or somewhere along those lines. Now, again, it's a very simple pathway. It hasn't got much sort of to it. We've added in some little details with grass, but other than that, it's a very simple pathway. But again, like all my pathways, we're keeping a little bit of a curve there as well, because I think curves are very important when you're building your pathways. Now, other than that, I've just detailed the area with a few little palm trees, a few little bushes, and a few little hills of sand on each side. And that's pretty much it. So as you can see, this one works really nice in this kind of theme and environment and would work great around an oasis or something along those kind of lines. I think it would really work well. With that being said, that is about it for all of the pathway showcases. Let's go ahead and show you a guide through how I actually start my plan of my pathways and how I go forward from where I am. Okay, so first of all, one of the most important things with pathways is to make sure that you have curves in them. Don't stick to simple straight pathways everywhere. You want to have curves here and there, and I try to make the majority of my builds and my cities full of curves, even if it's just a small slight curve. Now in front of me here, I have created a pretty big curve. As you can see, this is the base for my pathway. Now, like all my pathways, I do tend to stick to odd numbers with the exception of 2, as I think these work really great when creating a line for a path. The pathway, you can see we've got 2 blocks here to start with, and then we've got 3, 2. But as you can see, we're not going round to the corner. We're not doing this block here to sort of join up the pathway. My first line always goes diagonal when we're moving over. So we've got 2, 3, 2, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, and then 7 at the end. As you can see, that creates a really nice pathway. Now, it's very rare when creating a pathway that I stretch more than 7 blocks in a straight line, just because I feel it starts looking too unnatural, too boring. So I like to keep plenty of curvature in all of the pathways. Once you've got yourself a basic pathway lined out, think about how wide you want it. So let's say I wanted to create this one a 5 block. We're going to have this somewhere through a little town or something. So we want it 5 blocks wide. So we'd start by simply putting an outline all the way around the edge, including the corners. All the way around like this. We'd follow it all the way around to the other end. Then we'd come back to the beginning and we'd do exactly the same thing. Again, stretching it further around this time. All the way. Making sure you stick to the path. And then we would continue that all the way to the end. Once we get to the end, we'd do it again a third time and then a 4th time until we get to 5 blocks wide for the path that we want. Now, of course, you don't have to do it 5 blocks wide. You could have it at just 2 blocks, 3 blocks, 4 blocks, 5 blocks, 7 blocks, whatever width you want. This is how I make my pathways, and that allows them to look pretty straight. You know, when you've got the curves, sometimes you'll have bits that look wider, bits that look thinner. This allows them to look pretty much the same width all the way around from one end to the other. So it keeps them looking nice and clean and works really well for any path design. Once you have your section of path in place, you can see it looks pretty good. This curve looks pretty clean the whole way around, and the width of the path looks like it matches each other. It doesn't look out of place. So this is a great way of doing paths if you're trying to keep them looking sort of very fluid and very much the same width all the way around. Because it's very easy when you're building a path to have areas that end up looking much wider than other areas of the path and so forth. I find this way it really helps keep them nicely together and keeps a nice flow all the way through your entire path. Now that the pathway is all in place, I've gone ahead and textured it up, and I've raised it up a little bit and added some slabs at each end of the pathway so that it kind of has a smooth transition to walk up and down. And we've also gone ahead and added an extra section of a pathway. Now, as you can see, this is made of a dirt path this time, and I've decided to do a dirt path because this is going to be a bit of a gardened area. So, like I said before, it's nice to mix up the areas in your town with different pathways depending on where you are. So here's a clean example of how I would do that. You know, we're going to step down from our main pathway and have a gardened area with a dirt pathway. Next up, we have one of the most important things, and that is elevation. As you can see, I've used slabs and floor blocks here to create an elevation on this pathway. Now, this is really going to create a huge difference as you start building your town or village and putting it together. Having a little bit of elevation here and there really works well. Now, of course, this path ends here. It could go higher up into town or even come back down to the ground, depending on what we want to do after. But having that elevation is going to be a real essential point of really adding in a lot of detail to your village. You've also got to think about your houses you're going to be building. As you're building them around this sort of area, you will be bringing your roofs down. So you're going to be having lower houses down at the bottom and then slightly higher as you go up this sort of this bit of elevated land. And that's going to create some really nice views around your town as you're walking around it. The next step is to start thinking about where you actually want to be placing your buildings. Now, as you can see, I've got 3 markings here all laid out. Now, I don't overthink about the layout too much. I don't think about where I'm going to be crossing onto the pathway. I just think about where I want the house sort of to be and try to think of angles, you know, so that I'm working around with corners and stuff like that. So try and think about where you want things. Don't worry too much if you've got to sort of come into the path a little bit for your layout of your building, and don't worry if you've got to step it back a little bit. Any areas like this that you have with gaps after, you can go ahead and just fill them in simply with a couple of blocks. It doesn't matter, and once you're done, the pathway will feel very smooth and fluid with everything else. So just go ahead and dot in any blocks that you need to finish off your pathway. Now, the houses as well, you also want to consider where you're placing them. So obviously the lower ones down here, you want to make sure these roofs sit lower than the ones up here. So generally, as you're walking through, you want to see, as you're looking up the hill, you want to see the houses to start to look bigger. Don't create a very tall house on the corner here and then a small house on the hill here, because it's not really going to blend very well. So kind of keep towards the same kind of height, maybe a little bit in variation, but try to aim for the taller builds to be up the slope rather than down the slope. Now, other than that, guys, the most important thing is to concentrate on areas where you're going to be having your doors. You want to make sure you've got a flat surface like we have here, so we can be walking straight into the building. Again, we could go ahead and make this a doorway to be going into this house. And then this one here, you know, we want to create another doorway. Again, would be somewhere on this flat area. You could have a 2 doorway maybe about there. But when you have these buildings and they come down on the actual stairway, for instance, so say there's another building, if we grabbed some red here, say we had another building on a full angle coming down here like this, for instance, you'd want to make sure that you put a door in the right place. You wouldn't want to put it right here in this little corner here. So somewhere like about here would be a good point to put your door, okay, because you're on a fairly flat surface. You could fill that in. Your doorway would be right there. So just think about your doorways and try and plan them accordingly with the area of your pathway, making sure you've got a little flat area. And then that would be your floor level. So you'd want to make sure that anything below this area would be a basement in your building if you build a stairway down. But as you walk into the building, this would be your floor level right here. And then what you would do is either create levels down and dig down, creating a basement, or just work your way up from the ground. The next thing you want to think about is sectioning off your pathway. Now, I like to do this with different colors where possible. It's not always possible. Sometimes you have to work with similar color tones, so you might have to work with a gray path and gray walls. But as you can see in this example, I've gone ahead and sectioned it with the bricks, which is a nice red tone, and it really sections it off from the pathway, which is gray. And this works great because not only does it section off the pathway, it also sections off where we're going to be building for this little kind of garden area over here. And I think this works really nicely, and you can see already that it's already starting to feel very sort of smooth. The transition between the pathways and the wall and everything, it all looks nice and sort of feels like it fits together. And that's one of the most important things, is making things feel like they sort of fit together and they're organic and not kind of out of place. So the next step, like I said, small details. I often like to put these details in before I actually start doing my buildings, because sometimes these little things like walls and that, they can sort of influence your ideas onto builds. So if you plan those out first of all, they might give you some better ideas for your actual buildings as well. So think about that before you start putting your buildings in place, and make sure you have everything laid out beforehand. Now here is another really good thing to think about when you're building your pathways, and that's the sort of finer details around it. So like I said, this was going to be a little park area, but I thought about maybe adding in a stream here. Now adding in the stream allowed us to turn this sort of elevated bit of ground here into almost like a bridge. So now we've got the water stream running underneath it, and this adds a really cool feature. Not only does it add a feature to the area, but it gives us a better feature on the pathway now, because as you can see, that pathway now is starting to feel like a bridge, and it creates a nicer idea for the elevation and makes it feel again more natural with the surroundings. So again, this is a key point of thinking about your surroundings. We've also gone ahead, come around this side here and sectioned it off with the wall, and again we've got the area underneath here coming into this little small stream. Now streams are a great little detail feature, not only for your pathways but for your whole cities or villages in general. If you can fit one in somewhere, they create a really nice break between everything, and yeah, they just look really nice. They're a really cool feature, and they create a little bit of realism amongst what you're building. So just go ahead and think about your finer details as well. Now at this point here, I probably would have built my houses and that up first, but you know, I just wanted to show you my planning for detail first, because one thing that I am very big on, and that is my detailing, because I think the builds are a major point of your town or city, but it's the small details around things. The pathway is the key that makes up all of those finer details, because if your pathway is not in place, then you're not going to be able to create nice little areas like this that are going to really create that sort of nice flow in the terrain, creating something that feels very organic and real, rather than opposed to something that feels very flat, plain and boring, or straight with, you know, with nowhere to go. This creates much more interest. So here is what you'd be looking at for the final product, and I gotta say, I think this looks amazing. I'm so happy with the way this looks. Now this is my whole point, is that while the buildings have been placed in and it looks really nice, it's not the builds themselves that make up this area. These are some fairly simple building designs. There is nothing much to them, but that pathway is what really makes this area here look nice. It adds a whole bunch of detail, including the feature for this little bridge that comes underneath here. It creates that nice little section that comes over here to a gardened area, and that pathway in general. Had that been flat, this would be a completely different looking build and really wouldn't look so impressive. But what makes it impressive is the fact that that pathway is a highly detailed pathway. It's got a curve, it's got elevation, and it's got details that really make the difference. So guys, while you're building your pathways, just think about everything else you want to be building around it. Think of the smallest ways you can detail it. Find the best points and places to add those elevations, because elevations will always make a huge difference to where you're building and create some really nice peaks to add interest to little corners and areas like so. Anyway guys, I hope this has been helpful for you. If it has, don't forget to smash that like button, and I will catch you in the next one.